Okay, well, why don't we start? And I'm going to introduce myself. I'm Jamie Broderick, and I'm a director at the UK's Impact Investing Institute. My professional background is as the head of UBS Wealth Management UK, and before that, head of JP Morgan Asset Management Europe. Now, last week, the Impact Investing Institute celebrated its first year of operation, having launched in a period in which there's been an unprecedented surge of interest in sustainable and impact investing. My own view is that it's been catalyzed by an intense awareness of the threat of climate change, but then propelled further by the pandemic, which has not only contributed more momentum, but also broadened investor interest beyond climate change into other environmental issues like natural capital, but also increasingly into social issues. Now, the Impact Investing Institute intersects with much of the impact investing activity that occurs in the UK and increasingly globally. So I'm really pleased to welcome our panelists who are at the heart of that activity. Dame Elizabeth Corley is chair of the Impact Investing Institute, and Stephanie Sfakianos is a special advisor to the Impact Investing Institute. So I'd like to ask each of you to introduce yourselves more fully than I just have, starting with you, Elizabeth.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, A4S, for giving me an opportunity to come back, because Jessica very kindly asked me to speak very early on in the history of the Institute, which I'll refer to later. So I'm Elizabeth Corley. I've got a background in financial services, most recently as the Chief Executive Officer of a global asset management company, Allianz Global Investors. And I've been increasingly involved in the ESG and impact world over the last 4 to 5 years since semi-retiring. I'm also a non-executive director on a number of listed company boards, so see the other side of the discussions that are going on in terms of the impact of environmental, social and governance topics on boardroom agendas.
Great, thank you, Elizabeth. Stephanie?
So I'm Stephanie Sfakianos. I think my hot tip for the day would be, if you don't want to retire, be in the sustainability field, because there is literally an infinite amount that you can do to keep yourself busy that needs to be done. I also have a financial services background. Most recently, I set up and managed the sustainable capital markets business at BNP Paribas.
Thank you both. So we're going to start with a discussion with our panelists, then we'll move to audience questions, which we're really eager to hear. So please type directly in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window. And there's no need to wait until the end, so feel free to feed them in as soon as they come to mind. So let me start with you, Elizabeth. The Institute is new to most people, certainly globally. So could you give us some background on how it was established, who provides the support for it, and what its mission really is?
Yeah, thank you. Well, let's start with the mission, because that's always the most interesting thing. And the mission is really to accelerate the flow of accountable capital into investments which have impact as well as a financial return. And that impact could be environmental or social, but increasingly it's both because of the interconnectedness of those two issues. We arose out of some work that the UK government asked me if I would do about 4 years ago to look into impact investing in the UK. There was a time when the UK was a real leader and pioneer in impact investing. And then the government became aware that actually that leadership position was steadily being eroded as the rest of the world caught up and was innovating sometimes faster than the UK was. So I established an advisory group, and it was drawn from a complete cross-section from people deeply involved in social investment, purposeful business, as well as mainstream asset managers and banks and advisors who frankly were very skeptical about the topic. And what we realized was that actually there was no magic bullet as to why the UK was dropping behind. It was because we hadn't really focused on the topic in a concentrated way. So we formed a task force, which was later ratified by the UK government. And we basically addressed the 5 major reasons we could see. Most of them were industry, frankly. They were not policy, they were not regulatory. It was around industry behaviors, practices, and competence. And so we set up that task force. We were basically thinking we would disband within 6 to 12 months, but realized that what we were really doing was being part of a chain of fundamental shifts within the financial services and professional services ecosystem, and that we would be able to work better if we had a permanent establishment. We had a principle of working in partnership with others and in coalitions. This is a very crowded space. There was no point coming in and trying to replicate great work that was being done elsewhere, but we did have a role to play in bridging parts of the financial system and parts of the particularly social investment system that were not really connected. So we formed the Institute by combining with another great body, a National Advisory Board on Impact Investing. And we got support from the UK government, from DCMS and what was DFID, now the Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office. But we were particularly keen to remain independent from government. We wanted to help government in terms of being a sort of critical friend on policy and opportunities, but we absolutely wished to remain independent. That had been a feature of how we'd worked, and it was very important that we continued. So we also were very fortunate to get backing from the City of London and also from a number of financial services companies who saw that what we were doing was critical. They were viewing it very much for the reasons that, if anybody's listening to the Mark Carney-Reith lectures or saw him speak at our anniversary summit last week, it's because there is a huge opportunity here. There's a huge opportunity, which is a commercial opportunity, but there is a corollary risk of getting it wrong, disappointing, and even brand damaging if we do this in the wrong way. So these financial supporters have come in to give us backing so that we can really concentrate as a not-for-profit, doing things that are free, open source, as a public good, and particularly forming partnerships and coalitions with others to accelerate the way in which the market's going to develop.
Fantastic. The topic of impact investing is vast. So there's tons of momentum. Things are changing fast. The methodology is still nascent. It's still growing, and it's got teething issues. So there's lots going on, intense interest. The Institute has limited resources. So how does it focus its energies? How does it know where it's going to have the greatest impact? So what kinds of things are you focused on for the most impact?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. We looked at what were the major hurdles, what were the blockages, what was getting in the way of more rapid market evolution. I'm a great believer that markets can solve problems with the right prompting and the right frameworks. What was getting in the way of that? And we basically focused our work on the 5 priority areas that we thought would be most helpful, or where we saw somebody already doing that work, we contacted them and said, we want to work with you and help you to accelerate that work. So if I look at the major blockages, and we'll come to one of them I know later, which is around reporting and data. We'll come back to that one. One was, I'm afraid it's competence within our financial services industry. Many people in positions of influence, whether it's an asset decision, a lending decision, or a business decision, grew up in a world where you weren't trained to think about anything other than financial risk, financial opportunity. So as soon as you start to think about what people now call double or triple materiality, what are the factors that are not yet discounted by markets into valuations, into spreads? As soon as you start to get into that area, a lot of people just didn't know how to do it, or they had experts within their companies and they just delegated it to the experts, which meant it was a side topic rather than central to business. So what we did was working with organisations like the CFA, both the Institute, which is one of our supporters, but also the UK Society, was develop a competence and training framework to help people who are interested in reskilling so that they can absolutely be on top of this. And we work with professional organisations. It's free and it's a framework, but they can embed this into their own professional development programs. So that was the first thing we looked at. The second thing we looked at was that there is real concern about risk and return. We've got a 1920s, 1940s mindset of there's good or there's doing good. You can't have both. And therefore, when you get into that's accelerated by the sort of Milton Friedman school of it's all about profit and nothing else. And as soon as you move away from that, you're making trade-offs. So this trade-off mindset is a legacy from the last century that's being carried into this century. And there is absolutely no doubt that there are huge opportunities to invest with impact for outcomes and with accountability that generate really interesting financial returns, both in and of themselves and also as diversifiers. But many people with big fiduciary responsibilities like pension funds or family offices, wealth managers, have still been given this assumption that this is not in line with their fiduciary duty. So we looked around and realized that nobody was really focusing on this. We've had 2 Law Commission reviews prompted by the Department of Work and Pensions, which were great, but there was no real up-to-date, leading-edge legal thinking about this. So we worked with our panel of lawyers who worked with us on this and came up with a technical paper on fiduciary duty in the 21st century. And from that, 6 key principles. I don't know if we can share them, Jamie, but if we can, it would be great in the chat.
I'll do
but
that.
six key principles around how pension trustees can think about this. And I was a pension trustee for many years, so I know it can be pretty daunting when you're told that it's your personal liability and it's your personal responsibility. But the reality is fiduciary duty evolves, and there is now a duty to care about broader factors that are not yet in financial markets. Now, regulation accelerates that, whether it's EU regulation or whether it's the work that's happening in the UK. But there's no doubt at all that a consideration of factors which could have an impact on your portfolios is now deemed to be part of your fiduciary responsibilities. And I think within the next couple of years, we're going to get to a situation where instead of saying, if you're a pensions committee or a family office, why should I think about this? It's going to be, oh, why shouldn't I? I think we're really at that tipping point now. And the reason is because we've sort of historically thought there are events. It could be an oil platform disaster. It could be a pollution disaster, a supply chain risk. And suddenly those hit particular companies and we see the consequences on both their performance and their valuation. And we're used to these one-offs. What we don't realize is they're symptomatic of the fact that markets are not yet adequately bringing this sort of risk information into their valuations. And we're also seeing a great pivot towards opportunities as well. Opportunities, renewable energy is the easiest one to talk about, or real estate is another where we've done a lot of work around social housing in partnership with others and looking at getting really strong ESG factors around social housing. There are opportunities for making better investment decisions. So we looked at that as well. There are a few other things we've done on the international side, but I'm realizing this is turning into a monologue, so I'll stop now.
Well, I did want to ask you, Elizabeth, because you said something really, really powerful, which is we've gone from fiduciaries, trustees, pension trustees in particular, but fiduciaries generally, being permitted to consider social environmental impact, to actually one in which, in the world we live in, it's a requirement for them to consider social environmental impact, lest they come back to bite them later. And the classic example is carbon. But it's interesting that that switch is, I mean, there's still fiduciaries who are trying to get to stage one of that, which is, are we permitted to consider? And other fiduciaries have actually made the leap to, no, we must consider this. And I was intrigued to see that a member of an Australian superannuation fund, so pension fund, sued his fund for not taking into account the climate risk posed, and the fund then settled with the member, which to me looks like a bit of a victory for the member, and in the process conceded that yes, this is one of our obligations. We do have to be managing that. And I think it's a really interesting tipping point, which I would say we're reaching it in different places at different times, but I think it's a really powerful observation to make.
It's absolutely right. And you know, if you are a fiduciary, if you do have duties to care, ideally you want to be at least on the curve of that change in either regulatory or societal expectation or member expectation, as you very well pulled out. And I think one of our things we're doing at the Institute is to try and help pensions trustees and their advisors, and also family offices and wealth managers, to get onto that curve. We're not proselytizing about they must do impact investment. It's not about that. It's about having that opportunity to think about their responsibilities, their purpose and their principles, and helping them do that in their own pace and in their own way. I am concerned that it is a big move and it's happening much faster. If I go back even 18 months, if you'd asked me about the pace of change, I'd have got it wrong. I was out by a factor of 10, I think, frankly. The rate of acceleration is quite extraordinary. Now, we're getting towards 2030, aren't we? So people are suddenly realizing that that's not very far away. But I think it's really important for people to carve out time and think about this in their own ways, linked to their own priorities and strategy. And we try and develop tools that help them do that, to form their own positions on it.
I think that your momentum point is really interesting. I find myself describing this as, so you and I have a couple decades of experience in asset management.
Just a few, yeah.
I find myself describing this as the fastest moving trend I've ever seen in asset management. When you think about it, you go through asset management, the history of the last couple decades, and You know, it can be the move to passive, it can be the rise of DC pension plans, it could be a number of different things. I've never seen anything unfold this fast. And what it strikes me, and when something unfolds this fast, you can't look at your past history for guidance on the future for something that's unfolding this fast. So you talked about people with a 19th century or 1940s mindset, which seems quite dangerous to me, because for something that's moving this fast, you have to start to look into, you can't take the last 3 to 5 years and extrapolate the way we're used to in asset management. You really do have to have a different mindset about a different set of conditions.
You really, really do. I think that's such a good point. And it's not just asset management, it's also lending and other forms of capital financing. It goes right across the system. That's absolutely right. And it's interesting, the CFA has just published, it's worth having a look at, their sustainable investing survey, and it's a whole report. It's a really rich document, and in that there was 63% of asset managers said they now take ESG factors into account as part of their investment process. But it's taking it into account, and when you then ask what competence they have, very often they're relying on external sort of screens that they buy in and somehow try and use in portfolio decisions. When asked about one of the biggest concerns, 78% said they were worried that there was just insufficient quality of data, insufficient standards, and a risk of inadvertent or deliberate greenwashing or rainbow washing coming out of this. So you're right, it's a very rapid evolution.
Let me ask you a little bit more about that. So this notion of, you know, is the data available? Are there standards for measurement? What do we do about greenwashing? I mean, talk to me a little bit about what the Institute's position is generally about measurement and reporting. Where are we in the evolution of it? Where is it headed? How can people contribute to the development of measurement, reporting, and management of impact?
Well, you've obviously got the regulatory developments around the world. And I think with the change of administration in the United States, we should anticipate that some of the direction of travel there might reverse rather quickly from next year. But if you take that to one side and look at the other regulatory developments, there's no doubt that you've got prudential regulators saying this is a material risk factor that you've got to take into account. So we saw the UK, the Chancellor in the UK announced that reporting against TCFD requirements will be mandatory by 2025, and a significant proportion of that probably in 2023 will become mandatory. Now that's a game changer. That is a real game changer to make that mandatory. And the extent to which that flows through, not just to the companies, but also to the people who are investing in those companies or lending to those companies, that will absolutely be a sea change. You talk about pace and impact of change, Jamie. It will get even more dramatic, because we will suddenly have an acceleration of factors being pulled in to assessments of companies and their sustainability on profit streams that have not been in there before. So that's massive. I'm pleased that it's an alignment around TCFD in the sense that that's a global standard. I think the challenge, though, is it is only a risk-based standard, and it is only really on one dimension of environment, which is the carbon element. And what's really needed is a sort of standards framework which reflects much more of the integrated nature of a broader set of consequences from climate change, the social consequences, and what this is going to do for companies and their durability. And that's why I was very pleased to see that we've got an agreement among 5 key standard setters to work together towards developing common standards. Now, the Institute is very keen and working with others to accelerate the emergence and convergence of global standards of reporting. Because at the moment, I think it's asset managers alone spend about $700 million a year on sourcing data to enable them to think about ESG in their portfolios. And that's going to grow. And okay, whilst I like to see innovation and I like to see entrepreneurs coming up with new and wonderful opportunities, if you're spending that much money just sourcing data, you're not thinking about driving outcomes and you're not thinking about impact. And one of the session we've got is, how do you go from data gathering to assessment to management to outcomes? So I hope that through global standards, which is where the Institute's working, that we can really start to see that the base information improves radically and becomes a more consistent. I also think in the UK, we've got an opportunity because of the FRC's work on public interest statement. Now, public interest statement, we would call actually an impact statement. And we would love to work with a couple of corporates in the UK on seeing what a good public interest statement could look like and what that means for gathering information within their companies. So I think that's another area we're really working on, plus engaging in Europe in terms of how we might work with the European direction of travel to encourage, again, convergence around reporting. But this leads very nicely into the work that we've been doing with Stephanie and others, which is trying to make clear that the social benefits, the social co-benefits and the environmental benefits actually are not contradictory, and they're very complementary. And I do wonder whether, you know, talking about concrete examples of how you can make this real in financial markets, it might be good to talk about some of that work. Jamie, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's great. I think it's a great idea. I mean, you know, I think climate change has captured most of the airtime in impact investing, but even within the environmental category, I think we're seeing it's no longer entirely about carbon emissions. There's a lot more in the environment than carbon emissions, and even in something straightforward like renewable energy, which is about suppressing carbon, there are social implications. There are environmental implications. So when you set up a wind farm, what are the other environmental impacts to the biosphere? So I think this would be an interesting point, Stephanie, for us to talk about the green plus gilt. So just as an intro, I just say the Institute has lobbied the UK government to issue a green gilt. It was rewarded with an announcement by the Chancellor a few weeks ago that it will do so. But the Institute was proposing a green plus gilt. So can I ask you, Stephanie, to explain what is a green gilt and what is a green plus gilt? And why did the Institute think that the concept of a green plus gilt was such a powerful one, given the mission that Elizabeth has described?
Well, I think for the green gilt, I think is relatively straightforward. You know, we were really trying to capture the current market dynamics, which make it very clear that the dedicated, less price sensitive investor base, which is driving this enormous growth in the green market, has basically got green credentials. You know, I think we're very clear that, you know, that the COVID crisis has made people much more focused on the social, but in terms of the ability to measure the green agenda, and particularly the climate agenda, is the area where you can have that very clear, relatively straightforward, I say relatively before we get onto, you know, the challenges of scope 3 emissions, but relatively simple greenhouse gas emissions. You can capture that. As an asset manager, you can go to your investees and you can say, for every euro you invest with us, for every pound you invest with us, you are saving X number of emissions. And we know this because we've got information from our issuers on what they're investing in. So I think that has been relatively clear. And from an issuer's perspective, having access to that market is absolutely critical to the success of execution. And, you know, we hear lots and lots of anecdotal evidence that the pricing dynamics of you know, going from guidance on price down to where you actually execute, which is driven by this kind of fever of demand that comes from these green investors, is something that issuers very much like.
Stephanie, before we get into pricing, let me back up a little bit and just, if you said that green gilts are straightforward, but the UK government hasn't done it yet. So what's held it back? I mean, there are a dozen plus other countries that have issued sovereign green bonds. The UK has not. So on such
a green transaction is harder work. There is absolutely no doubt about that, and it is hard work for a sovereign. You know, I if they're listening, I wouldn't want to, you know, scare anyone off. But the fact is, the market is very closely scrutinizing these transactions for greenwash. So you have to comply with the 4 green bond principles. Use of proceeds, you have to identify meaningful projects with measurable impacts against which you can apply the proceeds for a bond. They need to be reported on. You need to have some kind of system for checking that the money isn't misappropriated in any way. You need to have a second opinion. But for a government working, I have to say, generally in my experience, in silos, you know, the Treasury doesn't necessarily feel that it's very close to the environmental experts. The environmental experts don't feel particularly close to the Debt Management Office. So bringing all those people together to say, this is how we can identify projects on which we can report coherently is an enormous undertaking. And you know, one of the examples that I've given in the past is talking to an issuer who was wanting to have subsidies paid to individuals, subsidies as part of their use of proceeds, because obviously it's money foregone, it's tax foregone, they're paying these subsidies. They weren't able at that stage to distinguish between subsidies paid for cosmetic home improvements with subsidies paid for green. So they couldn't say there was any impact because some of the money could have been spent on a new bathroom. Clearly, no environmental impact there. People do not necessarily always track these proceeds. They don't have the systems in place. So a huge amount of work is needed. You know, nobody should deny that. The benefit of the green bond, and one of the reasons I was so excited to be working on it, is that a government is in a unique position to be impactful. We need a lot of bottom-up groundswell of demand for green instruments. But, you know, as I think you've alluded to earlier, Elizabeth, there also needs to be the top-down in terms of the policy framework. We need governments to be setting a tone. We need them to be setting policy. And in my experience in working with green bond issuers, there is nothing like the fear that you're going to be accused of greenwash to focus your minds on setting up something that is robust, finding those projects which are most impactful, and then tapping into that investor base that has this green appetite. The plus side, I think, is really, again, acknowledging the current market dynamic, which we understand is particularly strong in the UK. You know, perhaps somebody on the call might have a view on this, to say we also need now, in the light of what we all know in a post-pandemic world, are the social impacts of some of these projects that we're working on. We need to fix the system. There is no social justice without environmental justice, and vice versa. And if you look at the government's levelling up agenda, if you look at the just transition agenda, we need to take people with us. There are industries which are going to be not wanted on voyage in the future. What do we do with the people whose jobs are going because of either environmental rigor, you know, miners in Poland, for example, or because in the current world, as we all know, there are just too many inequalities around the UK. How do we put all those things together? And the point of the plus was to say, let's make it green, because then this specialist investor base can buy it. But let us acknowledge that every single project must have some strong social co-benefits that will enable the government to meet that very strong agenda, the green jobs agenda, the levelling up agenda, you know, the just transition agenda. I think the second observation, you know, returning to for example, the subject of housing, anyone who's tried to do some energy efficiency work on their house, and in fact, one of the things I will post in the chat is the SEEB report that the Green Finance Institute did, which is very, very granular detail on the challenges of energy efficiency in buildings. You can't find people to do the work. There just isn't that level of expertise. So clearly, there are enormous social co-benefits involved in a lot of these green projects. So it's kind of a win-win. And I think what it reminds us is, you know, just to repeat, we need to fix the system. We can't be fixing things that don't take the people with you. And equally, without some kind of environmental justice, I don't know, just think of air pollution, for example. You know, there is no ability to deliver the environmental agenda. So I think it was really make it green, because that meets what the market is looking for. Make it social, because that delivers the broad policy agenda for the UK government.
Can I ask you for
I was just going to comment, Jamie, if I may, because I think, Stephanie, because when I looked at it was a Green Gilt, absolutely, but when I looked at the Chancellor's announcement, there was a very specific reference to the point about jobs, wasn't there? And then we had the 10-point plan from the Prime Minister. And I think virtually every point was linked to skills or jobs or community. So does the name matter? I was going to ask Jamie, if you don't mind, because I think there's a recognition that you can't just plough on with it being just an environmental project. This has got to be linked to the whole rebuilding of the economy, particularly given the economic conditions we're going to face in the new year. What do you think? I mean, it seemed to me like a logical fit. I wondered. What do you think, Stephanie?
We did a lot of research on this, a lot of outreach. And on the whole, investors were very, very supportive of the concept of the social metrics. One of the in fact, one of the discussions we had with the A4S team and the investment institution just suggested that they've actually had to rethink the way they are working this year to get the social metrics higher on the agenda. There's no doubt that it's very much a focus for people. I think one of the challenges that people still have, and this comes back to, I hate using washing for everything, but one of the challenges of worrying about social washing is it is simply not possible at this stage to have the kind of rigor behind the measurement of a lot of the social criteria that people have got themselves comfortable with on the green. What we're able to do with the better green projects is look genuinely at impact. One of the challenges that we have with social metrics is we can look at outcomes, we can look at outputs, but it's really tough always to look at impact. So, take, for example, the education piece, which I think is very, very interesting. You train 100 people to retrofit a social housing, and you make that a key priority. How do you know that in a year's time they'll still be working? How do you know that they will have measurable outcomes on houses that they've retrofitted? It's really quite difficult. And I think that is one of the things that's deterred people. And a couple of the investors that I spoke to said, we as asset managers feel very responsible to our asset owners to make sure that what we're doing is robust. And if you put in some social co-benefits, we really, really need to be able to measure them properly. So, I think one of the biggest tasks that we all need to work on in the coming months is just making sure that people understand. And we have Simon Bond at Threadneedle, for example, as part of a working group. We just need to make a start. We can't sit here waiting for perfection. We all say, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. But I think in the social sphere, this is really important. We do know that CDC, for example, in the UK is doing some work on the quality of jobs. It's happening, but we absolutely can't sit around waiting for perfection on social metrics before we start doing something, particularly given that I think it's going to be a lot more challenging to get social metrics that are universally applicable.
So Stephanie,
the social aspect is very, very local.
Can I just pause you? I want to come back to that local point, which I think is really interesting, but you've just said something, and I think Elizabeth, you alluded to this as well. This is an environment in which we know what we'd like to do, but the tools aren't always there. So it feels like, for carbon measure, carbon emissions, the tools are there. For the social aspects, it's much more difficult. But what's interesting about this whole movement is that in the absence, you say, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. In the absence of perfection, in the absence of very straightforward and homogenized and harmonized and converged standards, it feels like it needs some form of institutional and personal courage to move forward with the level of imperfection in the measurements. In other words, I think it just feels to me like what you're describing is, this is not a tick box exercise. We don't have everything we need, but we need to have faith that this is the direction we're going in. And so we need organizations and individuals to show courage to move forward, even if it's not all perfect. I mean, Elizabeth, comment on that?
I think that's very profound. And I think it's interesting because we're an industry, the finance industry, we like exact you know, we'll model things to 10 decimal points sometimes if it's a massive risk, or even more. So I think we're used to being able to be reductive, to gather all the data and come with one answer, whether it's 52 or whatever it is. But the reality is, in this, there is more judgment and there is more multiplicity of outcomes than a single outcome. And I think if I look back over the years at what substitutes for that certainty is quality of process and quality of work. And I think, Stephanie, we've talked in the past about, yes, we can't wait, but we can start to think about how you would get to better outcomes in terms of reporting and what we can do on the way. And I think there will be a big focus on processes and on improving data availability. Those are two inputs that go into getting better answers. I think the other issue, which I think is accepted in the energy space, but is less defined in the social space, is time frame. And you know, we've talked about this, Jamie, over the years, that the financial markets get faster and faster and faster, and algorithmic trading speeds up what's happening in equity markets, and judgments are made more quickly. This actually requires a long-term patient view. And I think that's also part of what we have to think about. That should be a perfect fit for foundation money, for pensions money, for family office money, where they're thinking about intergenerational responsibilities. So we also have to find ways of creating investment and lending opportunities that are longer term to address part of the challenges that Stephanie raised about when do you start measuring outcomes. And you have to be patient.
I want to, Elizabeth, I want to repeat what you said earlier, because I think it's really quite interesting.
It's always worrying when Jamie does that to you, Stephanie, isn't it?
No, not at all. What you've said is we don't have all the data that we need, but we can be very rigorous and we can be very rigorous about the process. And I think that's really interesting. I think it's a way of saying you don't have the excuse that you're looking for not to proceed, because it is within your gift to come up with a process that is rigorous, knowing that the data may come along later. I just think that's really interesting.
I'm a great believer in that, Jamie, because if I go back to when I was a CEO and I introduced a balanced scorecard at one point because we were just too fixated on one or two measures. It was very two-dimensional. And I'm sure you did the same when you were running your business. So we moved to the real things that mattered in terms of the long-term quality of culture, values, customers, employees, as well as, you know, new business and financials and everything else, product quality. And the big pushback from most of the business was, we just don't have the data. And I said, that's fine. We're going to start measuring it anyway, and we'll use the data that's available. And, you know, the innovation rapidity with which the data got better was remarkable, because if you talk to somebody about, well, you're not doing very well on X, and they say, no, but you've got the wrong information. You say, perfect, give me the right information. So I do think the act of measurement really shapes what is being measured. And I think there's a huge opportunity here. And we've got technology. We've got artificial intelligence, big data tools, natural programming language, that we can really start to think about how we can get industry-wide solutions as well as company-specific solutions. So I'm quite positive on that. I think it's really about making sure it does take a bit of courage. I think Stephanie's right, but it also takes vision. And I think this is around visionary people thinking this is the way the market's going to go. And I want to be part of shaping this market and making right outcomes. So I would put vision and courage linked.
Excellent. That's great.
Just one additional observation from me on this, because we talked a little bit earlier about this. It seems to me that I'm not by any means a mindless cheerleader for green bonds. I think there are good green bonds. I think there are bad green bonds. I don't think the green bond. I look at it as a necessary but not sufficient condition for us to promote the climate and environmental and social agenda. But the thing that I know from my personal experience, absolutely categorically, is that once you do one as an issuer, you have a very, very different view of the market, of your own business, of your own relationships internally. And the one thing it does, one of the conversations I had, this is not a joke, one of the conversations I had was somebody actually asked me as the first port of call whether the bank had a CSR report. The CSR guys, sat in their little silo, doing whatever it is that they were doing in those days. Everyone now talks to each other. So I think the point about doing this is it gives you a central focus. And I have absolutely no doubt that one of the dramatic positive impacts that a green gilt can have, and a green plus gilt can have even more, is it makes you look at what you're doing, and you may not, as you say, be able to do it perfectly now, but it makes you look at what you're doing, and it makes you look at where all these fit in to your bigger picture agenda. We have a goal, net zero by 2050. What are the steps we're going to take to get there? It's the sort of thing that makes you drill down very, very granularly into what you're doing, and to start flagging some of the things you're doing with a view to improving them, to measuring them, to do more of some, doing less of the others. And I think that's probably one of the biggest, most positive impacts that this can have. And it sets a good example. You know, one of the things we found quite surprising, as you know, which you'll see in the report if anyone looks at it, is that the catalytic effect of governments doing a green instrument is actually quite tremendous, because it sets the pace. And at the moment, we know that sterling is perhaps 4% of total outstandings. We're all looking to a post-Brexit world probably sooner rather than later. And I think we would very much like to see that market develop. And given the extent of, you know, the market share that the government has of total issuance, there's no one else who can galvanize the market and can catalyze this development in quite the same way.
Stephanie, can I ask you something? As you said, you've made a couple of observations about siloed thinking having to be brought together. And I'm just sort of curious, when you describe the government, you know, the financial people don't talk to the environmental people, et cetera. It ended up working because government came together. So who is it? So I'm just trying to think, do you have recommendations for other people who are trying to influence government policy? What is it that allows an organization, whether it's a government or a corporate, what is it that allows an organization to pull together siloed functions or siloed thinking and create a holistic solution that, you know, might be forward-looking, that isn't part of the business as usual? So do you have some thoughts on that? Or Elizabeth, do you have some thoughts on that? Because I think it's an interesting problem to solve. And I'm thinking, as you tried to make progress with UK government on the Green Plus Gilt, you did have to bring together those things. So recommendations for other people, either in a government context or in a corporate context, how do you do that? How do you get people to bring the silos together?
I have to tell you that, you know, again, you know, you hear, this is probably sort of, I don't know how true this is, but my understanding is that, I won't tell you which one, but one of the big sovereign bonds was done because a key decision maker had a brother who worked at Merrill, and they were having a barbecue one Sunday, and he said, yeah, that's actually a good idea, we'll do one of those. You know, you know, I think a lot of this is kind of embellished in the telling over the years, but, you know, the answer is, with the sovereign issues, is it's a political decision. Because, you know, we haven't quite talked about pricing, and I realize we probably haven't got that much more time. There is one question in the chat which we haven't answered, but, you know, it is a political decision, because notwithstanding what we say about pricing dynamics and all that excitement, a green gilt from a credit perspective is a gilt. There are no representations and warranties. There are no covenants. All the green element is done on a best efforts basis. You're not getting any credit improvement. There is therefore a question about whether or not you should be getting a big price advantage. On that basis, it's really quite difficult for a treasury manager, or, you know, someone like the debt management office, to get hugely excited about something which is a tremendous amount of work for them in areas where they do not have expertise. You know, the debt management office has to go on a roadshow, and they have to be sitting opposite investors, and they have to explain some stuff that really isn't their meat and drink. So it is complicated. So it is going to be, in the end, a political decision. And I think in my experience, this is very much matched in some way within organizations, because as some of you know, I started off wanting to do green bonds at BNP Paribas at a time when I was literally the only person in global markets who was paid to do sustainability. Everyone else was just volunteering. And they said, okay, go away. It's a nice green shiny toy, play with it for a year and we'll see how we get on. I did pretty well, if I say so myself. But the thing that really changed my life was the guy at the top saying, okay, we believe in this now. So then, of course, you had this wonderful ground up push from, and I know it's a cliche to say it, the younger generation, the millennials, really wanting to be engaged, the top down support. And then you meet in the middle. And I think in a way it's a very similar pattern. I don't think you can do this absent leadership, because leadership dictates where the money goes. But equally, one person can't push the water up a hill alone. The good news is they don't have to, because in my experience, this is something that individuals are really passionate about, and it doesn't take much to persuade them to get on board.
Elizabeth, does this sound familiar in a corporate context?
It does, and it does link to Dr. Iro's question in the chat, which I think we should definitely try and answer as part of this. Absolutely. I think the whole point of this is in a boardroom or as a CEO, it's got to be relevant for your strategy and ideally relevant for your purpose. And if it is, it's something you do. It's like anything. The first time you do it, it's difficult. The second time is easier. And the third time, you've got the learning curve advantages and you're getting it cracked. And I was talking to somebody who issued a social bond, the treasurer and the CFO of a large FTSE company. And they said it was really hard work. But what it did, to Stephanie's point, it galvanized the whole organization. There were people who'd never bothered about finance before, didn't know what a treasurer did. And it was so central to their purpose and so relevant for them that despite the pioneering work they had to do, it transformed the way they thought about their business and their accountability and reporting back on the sort of the outcomes of what they were doing. And looking at Dr. Iro's question, I don't think there's a fixed percentage.
Let me just read it out to people.
Oh, yeah, read it out. That's great.
So
yeah.
The question is, what percent do you consider corporations should set aside from their profits as a reasonable contribution to achieving climate-based social metrics in consonance with ESG? So what percent of profit should be set aside at corporations to cover?
See, I wouldn't even think of it in that way as a percent of profit. I mean, profit is an outcome of everything the company does. I think it's much more around your strategy, your purpose, and where this fits in your financing strategy as well. And it's the willingness to say we're going to put time, energy, and brain power into this, which sometimes it doesn't measure as a percentage of profit. It's actually the pre-profit inputs that make all the difference, frankly. And I think it will be very different depending on sector as well. I mean, one of the things we haven't talked about here is that, particularly on the carbon side, this is not an equal responsibility and it's not an equal opportunity. There are some sectors that are going to have to innovate and reform incredibly rapidly. There are others who have got a bit more runway. On the S, in terms of however we might define that, but work practices, responsibility towards supply chain, equal pay, fairness, equality, inclusion, and diversity, that affects everybody. And I don't see that as a slice of profit. It's like this sort of, in order to do good, I've got to give something up. Good business is actually good, sustainable business. This is part of how we should be running our businesses. I do, though, think it's a very fair question if you start thinking about complexity on assurance. What do you ask your auditors to do? And there, the typical thing, I sit on 2 audit committees. There's always a healthy debate about the level of audit fees and, by the way, non-audit work. So there is an element of hard cost attached to this if you want to sort of make sure that what you're doing is appropriate. But I don't think it's a percentage of profit, but it does take us into an area of making this a just transition and this is the work. When we did the work on the Green plus Gilt, we didn't do it alone. We're huge believers in coalitions. We did it with our sibling institute, the Green Finance Institute, and the Grantham Institute at LSE. And it was bringing those 3 minds together into a team to think about how we can address this that gave us the, I think, a real edge in terms of how we engaged. Plus, we weren't lobbying to issue the Gilt either. We just wanted it to happen. So I do think it's a great question because it's a very deep question. But I wouldn't start from the profit line. I'd start from the inputs in the company. And it goes absolutely to what Stephanie said about leadership, quality of leadership, determination, and vision.
Very interesting. Go ahead.
One observation on the profit, because I think, again, I like the question. The way I would look at it, and this is based on personal, personal involvement, is I do think companies sometimes do need to be willing to sacrifice profit to do the right thing. And in that, I would highlight for the big financial services industries, and I would emphasize short-term profit, because long-term is something different, is sector policies. So for example, if you're making a lot of money out of being in coal and you say, well, we have to stop being in coal, ultimately that's going to be good business, but in the short run, you've got some profit sacrifice that you have to make. I would particularly highlight something like tobacco, because I think we're still at the early stages of walking away from tobacco. But I know that personally, banks who have walked away from tobacco, and as I said, BNP Paribas did it while I was there. That's a chunk out of your profit. So I think it is useful sometimes to acknowledge that in the short term, sacrificing some of the businesses that you've been doing may involve a percentage of your profits, but in the longer term, I think we all have to agree that the only good business is sustainable business, which has both a social element and an environmental element. And clearly table is a struggle to fit into that longer term perspective.
Yeah. And that triggers two things, Jamie. One is, I used to be very involved in a sub-Saharan charity that if you went to the ground in, say, Malawi, and you looked at the livelihoods of people who are really living at subsistence livelihoods, so much of their income was from tobacco growing. And so it's fine for us sitting in our comfortable offices with running water and electricity to say we're not going to hold tobacco. And I that's an ethical as well as a values-based decision. But if we don't follow through and think about the consequences on livelihoods, we may be making our world better for feeling better when we go to bed at night, but we're making tens of thousands of people's worlds worse. So this joined up thinking, and I think this is also true in offsets, buying offset, and okay, there are some sort of accreditation of offsets now, which are very good, but the wrong offsets do more harm, frankly, than you feeling good about having your carbon offset. So I do think it requires joined up thinking, and I agree with Stephanie completely that can be more expensive, and it can also defer or change the nature of profit contribution. I think and you have to be honest about that, but it's the right thing to do for a sustainable business.
I've left too little time for this next question because it deserves a lot more than we have, but let me ask it anyway. From Simon Tavis. Market demand is huge and many are serious about the shift to true impact investing, looking beyond more passive ESG investing. The next question is, how can we get a better view on available, reliable, and meaningful impact investing opportunities? Energy transition offers many investment targets, but what are the other potential sweet spots and why? Where should we be looking? Elizabeth, can I start with you on that?
Yeah, and I think that is a brilliant question, which probably deserves a session in itself. And Jamie, you should answer some of this as well, because I know this is a particular passion of yours, and you're more expert on this than I am. So I'm going to come back to you on it as well. But I think he's absolutely put his finger on a challenge, which is, we know how to look at public markets, and we're reasonably aware in sort of real assets now as investors or lenders as to how to find opportunities. But finding real impact opportunities can sometimes be a real search for diamonds, and it's hard work. I think there are things that can be done. There are fora that exist, but a lot of it is still the happy coincidence that Stephanie talked about, the right conversations happening with the right people at the right time. And I do wonder when we come through into 2021 and we think about accelerating this for real outcomes, we do need to think about, I don't think market intervention, because market interventions tend to be slow, cumbersome and ill-directed, but can we create market fora where people can come together and genuinely look at opportunities together? And I think that's something we should absolutely be thinking about, particularly if we can do it in person, but also virtually, that there is a natural marketplace that we can stimulate. But Jamie, you look at this all the time. What do you think?
I do, and when I look at, I've looked at pension holdings in the UK quite comprehensively, and I would say my general observation is that for each asset class, there's an impact version of that asset class in virtually every category. So for real assets, for infrastructure, for private debt, for public debt, for renewable infrastructure, venture capital. So in each category there exists. They are not as numerous as we're used to. We've spoiled ourselves over the last several decades, expecting 1,000 investment options to be winnowed down to 100, to then be put into a beauty contest of 10, and then finally the one is left. that doesn't exist yet. So you have to work hard. And we talk about concession on risk and return. I don't think there is a concession on risk and return, but there's a concession on effort. But so as a fiduciary, you can concede on effort. That's allowed, even if you can't on risk return. So I would say there are lots of in each of those asset classes, there are lots of options. The way to find them is to look at the progressive investors who are already there. So you look at what the Dutch pension funds are doing, the Nordic pension funds, the government, the local government pension funds in the UK, the state and public pension funds in the US. They are doing this now. And one of the best ways to find it is to go look at where the progressive investors are already, have pioneered this stuff. So I do think we find categories really in all asset classes. I would go, my practical advice to this is to go look at what the pioneers are doing. They will tell you the art of the possible because they've already challenged themselves on that. So I'm gonna, sadly, we've run out of time on a really fascinating discussion. So before we close though, I'd like to ask Stephanie and Elizabeth if they have a final observation to make as a takeaway.
Go on, Stephanie. Go
to
first.
summarize the discussion, but just a
all right, I'll start. Okay, well, I think if we go back to the panel session title, which I'm just reading now, how do you know that your investment is delivering impact? I think the simplest thing to do is just simply start asking the questions. If you're a pension fund, ask some of your investment managers. If you're an investment manager, ask some of the companies in which you're investing. It's as simple and straightforward as that. And there will be ways in which you can think about the questions more simply and straightforwardly. There are tools out there, open source tools. The Impact Management Project has it to help you really think about some very straightforward questions. And it's amazing the answers you'll get.
Fantastic, pragmatic advice. Thank you for that. Stephanie.
I think what I would say is everybody is in the sustainability business. You don't have to be an environmental manager. You don't have to be a capital markets green bond person. Everybody needs to bring sustainability into what they're doing because what is needed is mainstreaming. We cannot have this as being a little silo that doesn't involve absolutely every aspect of our lives. And I think that if the pandemic has taught us anything, it's taught us that the system needs changing and it needs money to make it happen.
Thank you for that very inspiring close. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Dame Elizabeth Corley and Stephanie Sfakianos. Thank you to A4S for inviting us to participate in the A4S Summit 2020. And thank you to the audience as well for your interest and some interesting questions and challenges. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the summit. So thank you all.
Thank you. Thanks, Jamie. Bye-bye.